The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 2, Dragon and Soldier. Chapter 22. Jack had been trying his best, Dracos knew, and he'd done a remarkably good job given his youth and inexperience. Dracos appreciated that well, and once again was reminded that he could travel far and long here in the Orion Arm without finding a better partner. But for all his efforts and willingness, the boy was not a warrior, and to be honest, that meant he couldn't help but be a certain amount of dead weight. Both for that reason, and of course for Jack's own safety, Dracos was glad to have the boy out of the way for the moment. Now, he thought grimly as he moved down the tree trunk, their opponents would see what a poet warrior of the Kada could do. Or to be more precisely, they wouldn't see it. If all went well, they wouldn't see a thing. The first advance team was long gone by now, heading down slope toward the wreckage of the transport. But there were at least two more groups within earshot making their way stealthily through the forest. All of them human, Dracos decided as he tasted the air. He didn't know why the Wynyard's Edge seemed to have few, if any, non-humans among their ranks. But that curious fact would make this particular task easier. After nearly 2 months with Jack, human physical capabilities were a known quantity to him, and fairly easy to work into his strategy. He made his way back to where he'd left the Argus sensor and Jack's slapstick. The sensor was fastened solidly to the tree, but a little digging with his claws, and he soon had it free. Tucking the sensor and slapstick under his forearms, he headed back in the direction of the Kilo 7 outpost, trailing the sensor's twin cables behind him. He had to pause 3 times along the way, curling around himself and freezing to complete motionless beneath a convenient bush or thicket, as he ran into more trios of searchers. He studied each group carefully as they passed, trying to decide if they were all mere foot soldiers or whether one of them might be the line commander he was seeking. In each case, he concluded it was the former. Apparently, the commander was still somewhere in the rear, allowing his men time to neutralize any threats before moving out himself. For their part, not surprisingly, none of the soldiers took any notice of him, despite whatever sensor equipment and night vision devices they might be carrying. Intent upon locating a human fugitive, they had no interest in a motionless creature of an unfamiliar type. Even with the stops, it took only a few minutes for him to reach the sentry cage Jack had been manning earlier that night. No one was visible there, and for a few seconds he studied the area from cover, mentally putting the final touches on his plans. Then, tasting the air once more to confirm that no one was nearby, he set to work. The first step was to replant the Argus sensor where it would be partially visible from the sentry cage. He found a good spot about 50 feet away to the south, half hidden beneath a bush. He wedged the metal mounting rod into the ground, leaving the sensor itself free to rotate. Then, leaving the slapstick beside it as bait, he began playing out the cable toward the sentry cage. But not directly toward it. 20 feet to the east of the tree that marked the cage was another of the puff-top trees like the one where he'd left Jack. Dropping his end of the twin cables near the base, he crossed to the cage and sliced the cables at the end. The 2 cables, he had already noted, were held only loosely together by a series of connector loops. Gripping the monitor end of both cables in his jaws, he climbed up into the puff-top tree. Earlier, he had cut the sensor cable where it entered the Argus eye. Now, careful not to let it get hung up, he pulled the sensor cable completely through the connectors, freeing it from the control cable and coiling it up as it came. When the far end finally came free, he had a coil of over 250 feet. The other end of the control cable was still connected to the sensor. He gave it a quick examination, confirming that he could operate the mechanical linkage with his claws, then wrapped the end around a branch for safekeeping. Hoisting the coil of sensor cable over his shoulder, he leaped across to the sentry cage tree, the one the round Argus monitors were attached to. He worked his way around the trunk, then jumped to the next tree over. He'd noticed this type of tree earlier that evening during his brief search for enemy soldiers. It had 2 very different types of branches, one of them solid and unyielding, the other equally solid but far more flexible and springy. Choosing one of the second type, he tied one end of the sensor cable to it and threw the rest of the coil back over to the Argus tree. Leaping back to the Argus tree himself, he got a firm grip on the trunk and began to pull on the cable, bending the springy branch back toward him. The farther he bent it, naturally, the more resistant it became to being bent any farther. It took every bit of his strength, plus some very fancy claw work, to finally work it all the way into position. But finally, he had it in place. Tying the center of the cable to one of the Argus tree's thickest branches with a quick release knot, he gathered up the remainder of the coil and leaped back to the puff-top tree on the other side. Climbing up to the third layer of branches, he moved a few feet along one of the thicker limbs to a conveniently placed fork. Looping his end of the cable around it, he returned the coil to his shoulder and jumped back to the Argus tree. He could hear the sound of footsteps now, several sets of them, coming from the direction of the Kilo 7 outpost. Most were the cautious movements of the patrol soldiers he'd evaded earlier, but one was the slightly noisier tread of a senior officer who had perhaps forgotten proper sneaking technique. The line commander, it seemed, had finally decided to join his men in the field. Fortunately, the trap was nearly set. He climbed down the Argus tree with what remained of his coil, taking care that the cable not get hung up on any of the branches. At the lowest layer of branches, with this type of tree, there were no more than 8 feet above the ground. He pulled the cable taut and tied about another quick release knot connecting it to the branch. That left him perhaps 10 feet of loose cable. He tied a slip knot loop in the end, draped it out of sight across 2 branches, then climbed back to his first quick release, the one holding the springy branch taut. A gentle pull released it, and there was a soft twanging sound as the rest of the cable took up the tension. For a moment, he crouched there in the upper branches, tracing the cable with his eyes, making sure he'd gotten everything exactly as he'd planned. From the bent springy branch, through the edge of the Argus tree to the puff-top tree, looping around a third-level branch there, back to the Argus tree, quick release knot at the lowest branches, the rest in a slip knot loop. Perfect. Leaping once more to the puff-top, he retrieved the control cable and returned one last time to the Argus tree. Moving down the trunk, he set himself on the far side from his approaching opponents, hiding in a thick clump of leaves. And everything was now ready. Everything, that was, except for the one unknown still in the equation. The question of whether the commander and his men would behave as expected. There was no way for him to know. No way even for him to guess, really, at least not with any certainty. Human reflexes, he understood. Human eyesight, too, and hearing, and stamina, and strength. But in many ways, human way of thinking was still foreign to him. Their ways of thinking and their behavior and their basic fundamental reactions. And if he guessed wrong, all his effort would have been for nothing. Still, he'd gone this far. He might as well see it through. Besides, Jack surely understood his own species, and hadn't Jack agreed that these people didn't act like true soldiers? Peering around the side of the trunk, he could see the approaching group as they moved cautiously through the trees toward him. There were 5 in all, 4 patrol soldiers, plus the one who didn't step as cautiously as his companions. Like the others, the latter's face was obscured by the half-helmet he was wearing to support his night vision equipment. From his build, though, Dracos could see that it wasn't Sergeant Grisco. Pity. After Grisco's part in the betrayal and attack on the transport, he would rather have liked to deal with that one personally. The group was nearly to the sentry cage now. Keeping his movements small, Dracos dug his claws delicately into the meshed steel lines inside the control cable and gently tugged. There was no reaction from the edgemen. Dracos tugged again, this time risking a quick look over at the half-hidden sensor. It was moving all right, turning slowly back and forth. Still no response. Dracos tried again, beginning to think unkind thoughts about his opponent's competence. He could see the faint reflection glinting from the sensor's face. Why couldn't they? And then, just as he was wondering whether he should give up the effort, one of the soldiers spotted it. He snapped his arm up, his fingers rapidly tracing out hand signals Grisco had never bothered to teach Jack and his fellow recruits. The 4 patrol soldiers responded with all the smooth efficiency of professionals. Without fuss or hesitation, they drifted to both sides as they continued forward, moving to flank whoever it was watching them from beneath the bush. The 5th man did not join them. Instead, he eased into the sentry cage and stopped, watching nervously from behind the Argus tree. Dracos felt his jaws crack in an ironic smile. So he and Jack had been right. A true warrior line commander would have gone with his men into danger, taking the same risks they did so that he could issue prompt and reasonable orders if it became necessary. Instead, this commander was hiding from the danger. Sending his men into the unknown was all right, but he wasn't willing to even get his own scales dusty. As a warrior, Dracos could feel only contempt for such behavior, but as the man's opponent, he could feel an equally strong satisfaction. Because in his effort to protect himself, the commander now stood directly behind the very tree Dracos was clinging to. Exactly where Dracos wanted him. The control cable had served its purpose. Laying it aside, Dracos got a good grip with his left forepaw on the slip-knotted loop of sensor cable. Beside him was the quick-release knot that held the whole thing in place. Carefully, he eased the tip of his tail into the release loop. The patrol soldiers were closing on the sensor now. Dracos waited, and abruptly one of them snorted. "Cute," he muttered. "It's one of our own Argus eyes, sir. No one there." "But I saw it moving," one of the others insisted. "So did I," the first confirmed, hefting his gun as he looked around. "And the slapstick Barkin spotted on the scan is here too. Probably bait. Like I said, someone's being cute." "Trace the cable," the commander ordered in a hoarse whisper. "Find him." "Yes, sir," the first soldier said, moving toward the Argus eye as the others fanned out toward the surrounding trees. The commander hesitated another moment, then cautiously slipped out from behind the Argus tree, either getting his courage back or simply unwilling to get too far away from the protection of his men and their weapons. Circling the trunk, he started toward them. And in that fraction of a second, as he passed beneath Dracos, the Kada warrior struck. Releasing his rear claws, he dropped to the same level as the commander's head before grabbing hold of the tree again. With his right forepaw, he slashed the chin strap holding the man's helmet in place, and in the same motion flicked the helmet up and off his head. Reflexively, the commander grabbed for the helmet as it spun away into the night. Dracos was ready with the loop, dropping it over his head and arms, giving it a good, quick tug to tighten the slip knot around his ribs. At the same time, he slammed his right paw against the side of the commander's head behind his ear, a spot that experience had showed was a good place to knock out a human without too much risk of serious damage. And even as the commander sagged unconscious on the loop of cable, Dracos flicked the quick release with his tail and dropped to the ground. The quiet of the night was abruptly shattered. As the cable tension was suddenly released, the springy tree branch off to Dracos' right snapped back to its original position. It slapped and scattered all the other branches in its way as it moved, sending a small shower of leaves fluttering to the ground. The unconscious commander, tied to the other end of the cable, went the other direction. Shooting up and to the left, he disappeared up into the puff tree's branches. The soldiers facing the wrong direction saw none of it, but they could hear just fine, and as they spun back around, they could see the shower of leaves drifting from the springy tree. "Sir!" one of them snapped. "He's gone!" someone else barked. "What the—" "Over there," the first soldier said, pointing toward the springy tree with his gun. "Barkin, Schmidt, check it out. Watch for more booby traps. Tomaski, keep your eyes open. It might be a diversion." Two of the soldiers ran toward the springy tree, alternately peering up into the branches and watching the ground where they were walking. The other two crouched low where they were, facing opposite directions with their guns held ready. Keeping to the cover of the underbrush, Dracos crept out of the sentry cage and made a wide circle back toward the puff-top tree. The patrol soldiers knew their business all right. They'd quickly guessed the style of snare trap he'd just sprung on the commander. The only trouble was they were looking for him in the wrong tree. He reached the puff-top tree about the same time they arrived at their own destination. Putting the trunk between him and the two guards, he started up. If either of the soldiers at the springy tree happened to turn around, he knew, they would spot him easily. But with their attention elsewhere, he wasn't expecting either to do so. And they didn't. He made it to the safety of the branches while they were still staring uselessly skyward. The commander was hanging limply out of sight among the leaves, bobbing a little as the springy tree branch across the way waved gently in the breeze. Dracos got him up and lying securely across the branches, then cut the cable. He climbed a little higher into the tree, coiling the cable as he went. He wasn't exactly expecting the soldiers to go so far as to climb the springy tree in their search for their missing commander. Still, it was a possibility, and if they did, he didn't want them tracing the cable back here. Moving out onto one of the branches, he lobbed the coil across into the upper part of the Argus tree. "He's not here," one of the soldiers at the springy tree reported. "That's impossible," the first soldier insisted. "Check it again." "I did," the other said. "Twice. Visual and IR both. He's not up there." The first soldier swore. "A diversion, all right. Okay, spread out. Let's find him." "Right. Better call it in." "No kidding," the first one said sarcastically. "Base, this is Hernandez. We've got a problem." Listening to the conversation with half an ear, Dracos climbed back to the unconscious commander. The human was wearing two separate comm clips, he discovered. Even with them turned off, they might be traceable. Easily dealt with. Kadaw's forelegs were too short for him to throw anything that light very far, but there were other ways. Making sure the comm clips were turned off, he placed them together and wrapped them in the tip of his tail. A quick flip, sling fashion, and they sailed off into the night. Using the short length of cable still looped under the commander's arms, Dracos tied the human's wrists and ankles. One of his pockets yielded a headband, while the other contained a handkerchief. The handkerchief made an adequate gag. The headband was quite suitable for securing the man's hood down over his eyes. Now all that was left was to wait for the search to burn itself out and move to another area. Crawling under the underside of the branches, he found himself some convenient claw grips directly beneath the commander. After all, the searchers might eventually think to look up into this tree, and as Jack had pointed out, a Kadah heat profile did not look anything like a human's. An hour, he estimated, and he and Jack would be free to move again. Stretching his muscles once, he settled down to wait.